morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we moved into another area. We have left the wonders of the Panama Canal behind, and for those of you who this was the first time through, let me assure you, they are wonders I've been through more than once, and it never fails to amaze me. And now we head on. And I'll be telling you about the city of Miami today, its stories. And before I go any further, sometimes it's a good idea to sort of size yourself up in terms of just how important you are, just how much of an expert you are. And something happened, this is true, this really happened. Some few years ago, my wife and I took a trip to the Galapagos Islands, which are fascinating, magnificent, wildlife, none of it afraid of man. And one of the most unusual things in the Galapagos are these two species of very large seabirds called the boobies. There's a red-footed booby whose feet are bright red, and then a blue-footed booby which, beyond all reason, has sky blue feet. And so I did what any tourist is supposed to do. I bought a shirt with the birds embroidered on the front. And a couple of years later, on a trip in South America, where the highlight was going to be penguins, I was wearing this shirt, and a woman came up to me and she pointed, "Isn't that cute? You're wearing a shirt with penguins on it." And I said, "No, those are boobies." So let's keep ourselves in proper perspective here. We're talking about Miami. And the city of Miami is named for a sub-tribe of the American Indians known as the Miami. The Miami were a part of the Calusa tribe. The Calusa were actually rather important in South Florida before the Europeans came. They controlled pretty much all of South Florida, from just north of the Great Lake all the way down to the tip. The Calusa themselves lived on the west side of Florida, primarily around the Calusa-Hatchie River. It's named for them, and that would be there. The Great Lake, of course, is in the center of Florida. The Calusa were here, but they controlled all of South Florida, and the Miami were a subgroup, and they were named for the lake. The word Miami in their language means the big water. The lake still means the big water today, but in a different tribal dialect, it's Lake Okeechobee. Spanish arrived in 1565 in South Florida. A man by the name of Pedro Mendez de Aviles landed at the mouth of the Miami River and established a mission. He landed there in 1565. They put up a mission in 1566. But South Florida was not what the Spanish were looking for. It was not gold for the most part. It was just hot with a lot of mosquitoes. And so they left. And they went up and made their primarily establishment in Florida around the town of St. Augustine. The Miami and their mother tribe, if you will, the Calusa, had serious problems as Spanish colonialism grew in Florida over the 17th and into the 18th century. There were endless fights with Spanish settlers. At the same time, more powerful Indian tribes to the north, primarily the Creek, would come down on slaving raids, carry away large numbers of people, and these things greatly reduced the Calusa. Finally, smallpox, which was always brought by the Europeans without their knowing it, was introduced, and they never had resistance because smallpox never existed in the Americas. And by the middle of the 18th century, the Calusa had essentially been wiped out. They were gone. But they were replaced over the rest of the 18th century by another group of people. I won't call them an Indian tribe because they're not an Indian tribe. I'm talking about the Seminole. Seminole comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means wild or rough outside. And it was appropriate in response to these individuals because what the Seminole were, and still are today, were Indians that had been essentially dismissed from their own tribes, thrown out, runaway slaves, white criminals, fugitives, anybody who wanted to escape the law, anybody who wanted to escape civilization. All of them collectively gathered primarily in central Florida and moved north across the border into Georgia. There was trouble. Fighting began in 1817. Andrew Jackson, led a U.S. Army across the international border from Georgia into Spanish territory, fighting the Seminole. Slowly, the Seminole were pushed south. In Florida itself, one of their groups in far southern Florida finally led to a construction in 1836 of Fort Dallas at the mouth of the Miami River. The U.S. would fight the Seminole in 3 wars. But in 1821, Florida was annexed into the United States by the then Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And he would later become a United States president. The United States did not buy Florida. What we actually did was we sort of just accepted certain Spanish debt as being paid, and the state of Florida, or the colony of Florida, became part of the United States as a result. And it's a nice little trivia question. This is the only part of the coastline, the Atlantic coastline of the United States, that was not part of the United States during the colonial wars, during the Revolutionary War. In any case, the whole purpose of the fighting between the United States and the Seminoles was to try to collect them and send them out of Florida. And a considerable number were. The picture you're looking at is Osceola, who was probably the greatest of all the Seminole chiefs. He was finally captured and sent to Oklahoma, and he died in Oklahoma. So many of the Seminoles were. But the Seminole finally retreated into the Everglades, which, by the way, is not a swamp. The Everglades is actually a river. A river 100 miles long, 100 miles wide, and 1 inch deep. It's fresh water, it flows. You can look down, if you stand in the Everglades and look through the grass and look very carefully, you'll see that that water is moving, and it's moving south. So it's not a swamp. Still, it's a wilderness. If you don't know it, you can get lost in it and die. The Seminole retreated into the Everglades, and they have never been defeated. No peace treaty was ever signed with the Seminole to this day. The Seminole remain independent, if you will. In any case, Florida was developed starting from the north, making perfect sense. People moving in from the other colonies began settling Florida from the Florida-Georgia border south. By the latter part of the 19th century, by the 1880s and 90s, agriculture had become very important in Florida. By the 1890s, about 6 million boxes of citrus fruit were shipped north every year from Florida. But on the 29th of December, 1894, in Orlando, Florida, the high temperature for the day was 18 degrees Fahrenheit, coldest it has ever been in Florida. On the 7th of February, 1895, that same winter, at Palm Beach on the coast, it was 26 degrees. It was a hard, hard freeze. And in these great citrus growing areas, the trees were wiped out. It was so cold that the trees split. The fruit literally froze solid on the limbs. Citrus land, which had been selling for $1,000 an acre, wasn't worth $10 an acre. It was a catastrophe. There was a woman by the name of Julia Tuttle, who lived in Miami, which at the time was just a village. Julia was from Cleveland. She was a wealthy woman. She had come to the south and established citrus growing in the region of Miami. The cold didn't get down that far. The cold didn't get down much farther than Lake Okeechobee, so that the crops in southern Florida survived. Julia spoke to a friend of hers, Henry Flagler, who owned the Florida East Coast Railroad. At that point, in 1895, Florida East Coast Railroad ended at Jacksonville. That was Florida. Julia said, no, Miami is Florida. This is the real tropical wilderness. This is the real ideal tropical paradise. This is where it never freezes. And she talked Henry Flagler into extending his Florida East Coast Railroad all the way down to Miami, which he did. And on the 28th of July, 1896, the city of Miami was officially founded. And Julia Tuttle is the person who did it. She's the only woman to found a major city in the world. And the major city she founded was the city of Miami. She's honored in Miami with 2 things. First, the I-95 causeway across Biscayne Bay is called the Julia Tuttle. And second, there is a statue of her in Bayfront Park in Miami for having founded the city. In 1870, two men, a father and son, Henry and John Lum, bought the island that lay 3 miles offshore, off Miami, a long north-south island, completely unoccupied. They bought it for less than 25 cents an acre. Probably worth 25 cents an acre. You couldn't get to it, nobody much wanted to. But it was theirs. In 1876, the first structure to be built on the island was put up. And this is the structure. This is the Biscayne Life-Saving Station of the U.S. Life-Saving Service, designed to provide food and water for survivors of shipwreck. It stood at about what is today 72nd Street. But people began settling. The Lums themselves lived on the island. This is John S. Collins. He came to the island, took a large section of it, and planted it in avocados. He began growing avocados successfully and shipping them by boat across Biscayne Bay to the mainland. In 1912, he decided to build a bridge from the island to Miami. Water is shallow in Biscayne Bay, but it's a long way. And he began construction of his bridge. Unfortunately, before the bridge was finished, he ran out of money. But there was someone there to help. A gentleman who came down from Indianapolis, Indiana, a very wealthy gentleman by the name of Carl S. Fisher. This is Carl Fisher. In 1904, Fisher and his partner, James Allison, had purchased the patent in the United States for making acetylene-powered automobile headlights. In 1904, that's how it was done. And they founded a company called Prestolite, and they began making automobile headlights. When electric headlights came in 10 years later, they got the patent for that too. And by 1912, essentially Carl Fisher's company made all the automobile headlights in the United States. Carl was a man of some vision. He founded the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. That was his baby. He also conceived of the idea of having a road that crossed the United States from coast to coast that had the same name. There were no highways of any significance, and if you wanted to drive a long way, there were no road maps either. There were directories. They sort of remind me of today. You go down to the McDonald's and turn left. I think they put up all those McDonald's just so that people can use them for giving instructions. Well, in 1912, you could buy directories. Drive 3 miles out of town till you see the Red Barn, turn right, not a way to drive cross country. His idea was a single road with a single name from coast to coast, and he named it the Lincoln Highway. Never made it all the way, but brilliant idea nonetheless. Fisher already lived in Miami in the winter. He loaned John Collins the money he needed. Collins finished his bridge, 2.5 miles long, made out of wood, at the time, the longest bridge in the world. And he shipped his avocados to market successfully. By 1912, the only significant buildings on the island were the mansions of the Lums and of Carl Fisher and of John Collins. But with the construction of the bridge, people began coming. And first bathhouses and then lunch stands were built. The first hotel to be built on the island was built in 1915. It was Brown's Hotel at 112 Ocean Avenue, and if you want to see what it looks like, you still can, because it still stands today. That's Brown's Hotel on Ocean Avenue, and on the 26th of March, 1915, John Collins chartered the establishment of the city of Miami Beach. World War I got a bit of it in the way of business for a time, but after World War I, there was a period of booming prosperity in the United States, and with that, the eyes of certain developers began turning south, very much helped by Carl Fisher. Carl Fisher determined to build up Florida to make it what it ought to be, which was America's tropical playground. And so he rented a lighted billboard in Times Square in New York, year-round. And on that billboard it said, night and day, 24 hours a day, it's June in Miami. It worked. Developers came. And in the early 1920s, a genuine building boom took off in South Miami. Not only a boom on land, a boom on building property, on houses, on building hotels. Speculators came, and they made a lot of money very fast, mostly on paper. But it was a kind of hysteria. There's always a bit of hysteria in this kind of thing. Some pieces of property in Miami were bought and sold 10 times at auction in a single day. Profit on every step of the way. They were throwing up hotels, throwing up other properties. It was a wonderful circus. Everybody was getting rich on paper. And because of the building boom and the fact that some of these speculators also were speculating in the construction of these buildings, some of them began buying up carloads of building materials and then storing them, waiting for the prices to get better. And carloads and train carloads of building materials began being stored on sidings all across the southern half of the state of Florida, to the point where finally the three railroads that at that time now served Florida, Florida East Coast, the Seaboard, and the Atlantic Sea Line, found that it was a kind of a traffic jam on their lines. And in October of 1925, they declared a special law. We will stop all traffic entering South Florida except for food and fuel, because we just don't have the ability with all these stored boxcars to deal with all of this. On the 26th of January 1926, a ship, an ex-Danish yacht called the Prince Valdemar, steel-hulled, 241 feet long, was being towed across Miami Harbor to be permanently tied up and made into a floating hotel. Something went wrong and she sank. And she sank right in the channel. Suddenly, there was no way to get building material into South Florida by ship. There was no way to get building material into South Florida by rail. Everything had to stop, sort of step back and take a deep breath. And when they took a deep breath, some of the buyers realized just how crazy all of this had been. And just a little infusion of good sense was enough for the bubble of the South Florida land boom to burst, which it did. Miami Beach had been involved in the boom as well, and therefore in the bust. But it wasn't a complete bust. The weather was still wonderful. And through the early 30s, the beginning of the Great Depression, of course, put the final lid on overall speculation in Florida. But there was some construction. Small, little hotels were still being built on Miami Beach for people of modest income to spend brief economical vacations in South Florida. But that was as much as it went. And then, of course, World War II began. When I say World War II began, I mean the United States finally entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And there was fear that this would be a terrible blow to the very struggling economy of South Florida as well, because obviously all these beachfront hotels and beachfront businesses would have to shut down at night. They couldn't keep their lights on because the east coast of the United States got most of its petroleum from Venezuela. That petroleum was refined offshore, off the South American coast, at refineries on Aruba and on Curacao and on Trinidad, and then tankers carried it up the coast. You couldn't have those tankers going by these brightly lit cities at night, could you? Well, for the first 6 months of 1942, you could, because the city fathers, God bless them, of Miami Beach and other beachfront towns said, we can't turn off the lights, the tourists will stop coming. At the same time, the U.S. Navy, run at that time by Ernest King, was a little slow in catching on to the idea of convoying. And so for the first 6 months of 1942, German U-boats surfaced at night offshore and saw these beautifully silhouetted tankers going by, silhouetted against the lights of the cities. 607 Allied ships were sunk off that coastline in the first 6 months of 1942. They said you could stand on the beach at night and see this wonderful red glow on the horizon, which was a burning tanker, maybe more than one if it was a good night. The Germans called it the happy time. But the US Navy caught on. By 1943, we were using convoys. We had designed new sub-chasing boats and special anti-submarine aircraft. And by the summer of 1943, if there was a light on the horizon, it was a burning U-boat. After World War II, prosperity returned for real, and construction resumed. Miami Beach is long and narrow, north and south, and it's very neatly bisected by its major commercial street, Lincoln Road, running east and west. And those 1930s hotels, the little ones, were built on Collins Avenue across from the beach, south of Lincoln Road. Now, after World War II, with prosperity back, major hotel construction resumed again on Collins Avenue on the beach, north of Lincoln Road. Big, magnificent hotels, each one fancier than the next. Each building season, they'd put up another one. And each winter, the newest hotel, the northernmost end of the strip, was the inn hotel for that season. The Nautilus, the Sand and Surf, the Saxony, the Algiers, the Fontainebleau, the Eden Rock. Each one was that year's inn hotel. And all of Miami Beach, Miami as well, bloomed with prosperity, which went on for 15 years until it was killed by the jet plane because the inn vacationers stopped coming. All of a sudden, inn vacationers didn't come to Miami, they went to Maui, they went to Mallorca, they went to Marrakesh. Hotel construction slumped, and Miami slid back into a relative depression again. Interestingly enough, those little hotels south of Lincoln Road that were built in the 30s were rediscovered a couple of decades later by what we would have to call fashionistas. They're Art Deco gems. They were repainted in bubblegum colors. And they had become actually just retirement homes for elderly retirees on limited budgets. All of a sudden, hush puppies and hobby pants gave way to $600 jeans and Jimmy shoes. South Beach was born. Many of you saw the movie The Birdcage. The exteriors of the supposed club are actually the Carlisle Hotel, which still stands at 1225 Ocean Avenue today. And all of Miami resumed as a fashionable destination, not as fashionable as it was in the late 40s and early 50s, but fashionable enough to pay the bills with a little bit left over. The history of Miami was, and much of the United States, was irrevocably changed in 1959 because a rather amiable ex-ball player named Fidel Castro assumed control of the government of Cuba just 90 miles away and proceeded to begin allying Cuba with the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, upper class, upper middle class, even middle class families in Cuba panicked. The first thing that panicked them was the fear, not completely unfounded, that the Castro regime was going to start sending their children to Eastern Bloc schools to be properly indoctrinated in the truth of history. And so in the first year or two after Castro assumed power, some 14,000 children were sent from Cuba into Miami to escape the reach of the Cuban government. And then they were rather rapidly followed by their parents and many others. Hundreds of thousands of upper and upper middle class and middle class Cuban Americans, professionals, doctors and lawyers, business people, educated people, fled to Miami. Some of them came well prepared, money waiting for them. They had seen it coming or they were lucky. Others came with nothing but the shirts on their back. But they came, and they became a powerful new part of South Florida, the Cuban Americans. And they integrated. The first thing they did was to form organizations to help each other. If an individual arrived with nothing but the shirt on his back, but he knew something, he wanted to start a business, he had a skill, other Cubans who had been successful, who had connections with banking, would help him out. And they would get those loans, and they would get the businesses started, and they would help each other. And whole sections of Miami that had been commercially quiet neighborhoods of retirees suddenly became part of what would later be called Little Havana. The large area around Southwest 8th Street in Miami, which had been, in the 30s and 40s, a quiet, retired Jewish neighborhood, became the center of Little Havana. And 3555 Southwest 8th Street is the headquarters of Cuban America in Miami. It's the Versailles restaurant. You want a really great Cuban meal? There. You want to sit down and talk politics? There. You want to get a little anti-Castro off your chest? There. The Jewish residents earlier tended, for the most part, to be liberal. Cuban Americans were not liberal. They're conservative in their politics. Their children are even more conservative. I will offer up for you Marco Rubio, who may be the next president of the United States, or not. But Versailles is the place to talk politics. Little Havana is vibrant, it's robust, mom and pop operations, Cuban food, Cuban style. The whole concept of Latin America moving onto American soil took root and flourished in South Florida, and it continues to flourish in South Florida. A leading aspect of this was Cuban culture, Cuban music. Perhaps the one organization, more than any other, that began this conversion was a band called the Miami Sound Machine, and their leading singer, Gloria Estefan. And Miami became more and more Latinized. And in addition, something brand new happened. There had been two centers of electronic communications in the United States: television broadcasting, music recording. One was New York, the other was Los Angeles. Now there was a third, and that was Miami. Miami first became a center for the production of Spanish language television. There are three primary Spanish language networks operating in the United States: Univision, Telemundo, and Unival. All three are headquartered in Miami. They have their production studios in Miami. Most of their programming is produced in Miami. Telemundo turns out their talk shows and their soap operas. The whole concept of electronics on film, on tape, now has a third center. And music production: Universal Music Latin, Sony Music Latin, giants in the recording industry for what they call today salsa, for Cuban and for Latin music, are also headquartered in Miami. And there are dozens of smaller recording studios as well. And in order to make all of this happen, we can really thank two people. The first is Fidel Castro. Cuba was taken by the United States during the Spanish-American War, taken away from Spain in 1898. The U.S. held it for just 2 years to prepare it for independence, and then it became independent, but the ties to the United States were strong. It was, however, what we might call an agricultural colony of the United States. It grew a lot of sugar and other tropical fruits and tropical vegetables for the American market. And that's what it was primarily. After World War II, with some help from somewhat colorful, shall we say, American partners, it also became a great center of hotel and recreational and casino recreation for wealthy Americans traveling down to Havana as well. But that's all. When Castro took over, he changed all of that. Cuba became essentially a communist prison. All that Cuban culture came to Miami, as we have just described. But it was more than just the music. It was more than just even the food. Starting about 1900, there was a unique kind of sandwich which was brought to the United States by Cuban cigar makers who settled primarily in Tampa at Ybor City. It was called the Cuban sandwich, and only Cubans ate it, but not anymore. It's the food of Miami now. Food changed, culture changed, but the American viewpoint to the South changed as well. We've always had a somewhat comical relationship with Latin America. Many Americans today probably are less ignorant about South America than they used to be. It wasn't so very long ago, in my lifetime, if you ask the average American, even a reasonably well-educated American, to describe a classic South American, he'd talk about a peasant in a sombrero sleeping under a tree. Not anymore. Miami was very big in opening up the Latin market in terms of business, in terms of economics. Today, Miami is the second largest international banking center in the United States, behind New York City. And that international banking in Miami is directed south. The Port of Miami is a major cargo port for goods going from the United States south and for goods coming from to the United States from the south. Miami International Airport, one of the major international hubs, again, mostly to the south. It has been opened up to American eyes that the South, that the Latin world is an important world for business and for all of us. One other thing. As the cruise industry has grown and the understanding of what areas of the world are worth cruising, Cruise Port Miami has grown to the point where it is not only the largest cruise port in the world, but it dominates the world so totally that 1 out of 7 of every cruise originating anywhere in the world originates in Miami. All of that we can thank Fidel Castro for. But of course you can't just start an electronics industry, a TV industry, without expertise and specialists as well. And for that, we have the other fellow, who is in his way every bit as important. And I know about 1 or 2 of you can even tell me who it is. This is the other fellow. Jackie Gleason was born on the 26th of February, 1916, at 364 Chauncey Street in Brooklyn. But his family quickly moved, and he grew up at 358 and a half Chauncey Street in Brooklyn, which is the home of another very famous couple. Anybody know who? Ralph and Alice Cramden live at 358 and a half Chauncey Street in Brooklyn. The Gleason family was not a happy family. There was no money. Jackie's father walked out when he was just 12. He and his mother had to make do as best they could. She was a modest woman. She worked hard. She did the best she could, but she died when he was only 19. He was on his own with no money, but he did have a skill. He could make people laugh. He could look at people and he could see what was going on and he could make characters out of them. And he began working in the cheapest of the cheap nightclubs as a sometime MC, as a sometimes comic. He had a flair. There is a story that on one occasion, Sonja Henie, the Norwegian gold medal figure skater who became a movie star, walked into one of his clubs. He walked over to her table, put an ice cube in front of her and said, "Okay, do something." By 1950, he had a bit of a reputation, and interestingly enough, the movies were starting to look his way, but not as a comic. He's a big man, dark coloration. They started hiring him for gangster movies. And if you watch today some films from the middle and late 40s, Hollywood, not A films, B films, B gangster movies, you'll see him. He's the third gangster from the left. So he began getting small parts, and he would take them, and he would travel by train from New York to Hollywood. It would take 3 or 4 weeks to do the filming, then he'd travel back. He wouldn't fly. If God wanted us to fly, he said he wouldn't have given us the railroads. But television was also starting to call. And in the late 40s, Dumont TV, which was the number 4 network of the big three, offered him a standard contract. They had a show called The Cavalcade of Stars, and they offered him 2 weeks as MC at $25 a week. He wouldn't take it. He said, I'm not going out to the West Coast on the train for $50, forget it. So they raised it to 4 weeks. And in 4 weeks, he started to catch on. And one thing led to another. And in 1952, CBS Television stole him from Dumont. Wasn't very hard. Gave him his own show, and he became a star. We know the rest of the story. By 1964, he was a major star. There were only 2 places in the country to film or to broadcast TV, New York and LA. LA was alien to him. New York was home, but it's not real fun in the winter. He said, I'm a star. I want to live on the beach. I'm going to take my show down to Miami Beach, and I'm going to broadcast it from there. There are no facilities in Miami Beach. There will be when I get done. In 1964, Jackie Gleason moved his show, Lock, Stock, and Dancers, the June Taylor Dancers, by train from New York to Miami. The trip took 10 days. Not because it's a 10-day trip from New York to Miami, but as Jackie himself later said, the whole train was one big bar car. And he began broadcasting from the Miami Beach Auditorium. And if you remember, every show opened with the same tag. Live from the fun and sun capital of America, Miami Beach, the Jackie Gleason Show. And that's what it took. His show and his technicians and his equipment finally caused the formation of studios to be built, allowed the culture to be ready when the Cuban Americans moved in and began demanding their own networks. Jackie Gleason died on the 24th of June, 1987. He's buried at Our Lady of Mercy Catholic Cemetery in Miami. And on his mausoleum is as good an inscription as I've never seen anyone have. His inscription is, and away we go. Absolutely. And Gloria Estefan and the Miami Sound Machine and the Cuban Americans indeed took it from there, and away it went. Miami has greatly grown since then. Miami has expanded. Miami has become much more diverse. We're looking here at the picture of the result of a hurricane. In 1906, a powerful hurricane struck the area long before Miami Beach existed, but it did there what it often does. It made a cut right through the island of Miami Beach. It literally excavated a channel, separating a large island at the southern end from the rest of Miami Beach. That excavation, carved by the hurricane, is now what we call Government Cut. It is the port of Miami. And the island to the south is Fisher Island. It's named for Carl Fisher, who once owned it. But nobody much lived on Fisher Island, not for a while. In the 1920s, the Vanderbilts built a house on the island, the only one, with all of the attendant support, and it was their winter place. But no one else followed. Finally, in the 1960s, a partnership bought Fisher Island. The partnership consisted of ex-US Senator George Smathers, a Key Biscayne businessman by the name of B.B. Rebozo. Some of you remember his name. And of course, the ex-Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon. Now, neither Nixon nor Rebozo nor Smathers ever lived on Fisher Island. Rebozo lived on Key Biscayne. Nixon lived next door to him. But they began developing it. And in 1980, Fisher Island went up for sale, parcel by parcel. They built blocks of Spanish colonial 1920s-style mansions, blocks of similarly grand, spacious, beautifully developed apartments, only for the most of the most. There is no access to Fisher Island. There never was, and there never intended to be. If you want to get on Fisher Island today, there are only two ways to do it. There's a marina. The marina is open to residents of Fisher Island and invited guests of residents, period. Or there is a ferry that runs just across the channel from the Port of Miami. The ferry is open to residents of Fisher Island and invited guests of residents only. It's really very lovely and very expensive. And among the residents on Fisher Island today, there is retired tennis star Boris Becker. Mel Brooks, the filmmaker, has a home there. And the great champion of aristocracy and privilege, Oprah Winfrey. The per capita income of the people on Fisher Island is the highest per capita income of any piece of property of its size anywhere in the world. I understand it's very nice over there. But the thing that created Fisher Island has always been a factor in Miami, because it's always been a factor in South Florida. And of course, it's the hurricane. I like to say that people live under volcanoes everywhere in the world. And by that I mean they all live somewhere where there's some kind of natural catastrophe that will strike from time to time, be it an earthquake or a drought or a flood or a volcano. And of course in South Florida, it's the hurricane. Hurricanes are phenomena of nature. They are incredibly powerful cyclonic storms, circular storms, powered by warm ocean water, giving off energy which is dissipated by rising in this great spiraling circle, carrying up with it vast quantities of water. Hurricanes are extremely powerful. They can carry winds of 160, 170, 180 miles an hour at their top. As they come ashore, they often push the ocean in front of it in what's called a storm surge, 20, 25 foot high, not waves, but the whole ocean just rises up that way and rolls across the land. On the 18th of September, 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane struck, killed 375 people, and it pretty much put an end to the Florida land boom. But the biggest hurricane ever in history in the world, in terms of property damage, hit Florida on the 24th of August, 1992. This was Hurricane Andrew. Didn't kill that many people, just 62, but it rolled ashore very powerful, winds well over 160 miles an hour. It did not strike Miami exactly. You can see the radar track, it's just south. It hit Florida City, Homestead, and attendant communities, this whole vast southern and southwestern suburb of Miami. Rolled across it. The great growth of South Florida in the 70s and 80s allowed these communities to be built up enormously, miles of new suburban development. And in the construction, everybody made the same mistake. You put up a house, you put up the concrete walls or the cinder block walls, you reinforce them appropriately so they can support the weight of the roof is fixed down onto the walls, everything is fine. Not for a hurricane. Because if a hurricane strikes a building like that and happens to break a window or blow open a door and get inside, it lifts that roof right off. And when the roof goes, everything goes. And all of those houses, hundreds of thousands of them, were built that way. And the devastation was inconceivable. 63,000 houses ceased to exist. 110,000 others were so badly damaged that they were torn down. It was as if the world's biggest Oklahoma tornado, because that's what a hurricane is, same kind of storm, but an Oklahoma tornado 15 miles wide rolled across South Florida. Tens of billions of dollars in damage. Fortunately, not many lives lost. The insurance industry in South Florida has not yet recovered from the losses. They've changed the law so that now when you build a house in South Florida, you don't just make the walls strong enough to support the roof, you lock the roof onto the walls. So even if you break a window, that roof does not just take off and become an aircraft. Not anymore. But Miami is a big city now with fascinating new attractions as well as the old. The NBA Heat play in the Miami Arena. The baseball, big league Miami Marlins play in a magnificent new baseball stadium where you can play baseball indoors if the weather's not all that nice, or outdoors if it is. The Miami Dolphins play in Joe Roby Arena. Coconut Grove, just to the south of the city, is very funky. It's got eclectic restaurants. It's an intriguing place. Coral Gables, a little city of its own, has special open-air trolleys that run back and forth. People used to say, Miami is just New York City with palm trees. It still is. But now, Latin salsa, Latin spice has been added because some like it hot. The story of Miami. Thank you. We have one more story to tell as we sail north, and that is as we approach another fairly large city at the end of our trip. And it is a story that I call New York City, the Golden Door. That'll be near the end of the trip, just one more. Anybody have any questions about Miami before I... What is the population of Miami today? Miami is well over 1 million people. If you count the attendant area around it, it's about 3.5 million. Between Miami and Coral Gables and the other areas of South Miami that are within the Dade, Broward County metropolitan area. Sir?
Can the Port of Miami accept post-Panamax ships?
Can it accept? I don't know. Very good question. Can the Port of Miami accept post-Panamax ships? With the expansion of the size of the Panama Canal, ships are going to get longer and they're going to get deeper. A lot of American ports today are not prepared to handle ships that big. Obviously, all ships are going to have to be, or all commercial centers that deal with ships are going to have to be converted so that they can handle them if they want to stay viable. I'm sure that the people in the Port of Miami are very much aware of this. I don't know if they've made the change yet, but I'm sure they will. It's just, it's life and death. Ma'am?
Just a point of interest, the wall at JetBlue, Florida, is the old wall from Fenway.
Very interesting point. The lady points out that the wall, and you're talking now about the outfield wall in the baseball stadium, is the old wall brought down from Fenway Park in Boston. I like things like that. Thank you. Sir?
Trivia.
Yes.
Everyone's probably heard of a Tom Collins. I think I've heard there's a John Collins.
Yes.
What's the difference?
John Collins was an avocado planter in Miami Beach in 1915.
I'm talking about the drink.
I don't know.
It might be with gin instead of...
It could be with gin instead.
and
I'm sorry. Ma'am?
Would you talk about Elian Gonzalez?
That's a whole separate subject. Elian Gonzalez was a boy who was caught up in a family problem in Cuba. His mother died. His father, his uncles brought him to America. His father was a relatively low-paid worker in Cuba, but Cuba announced they wanted him back. This is 25, 30 years ago, and I think it was during the Carter administration. And there were those in the United States that says, no, he's found freedom, keep him in the United States. Others say he must be returned to his father who loved him, and others said his father had no use for him. The Castro regime is using his father as a puppet to give the United States a bad name. It went back and forth. The ultimate answer to the question is Elian Gonzalez was sent back to Cuba. We don't know what happened to him. Sir?
I understand, I read recently that Elian Gonzalez has said that he wants to come back.
Well, I'd be very, the gentleman says He has read recently that Elian is still alive and has stated that he'd like to come back to the United States. In that case, Elian is a very wise young man. I will make one last little point before I leave because I'm too smart not to keep myself out of trouble. We are in the process today, and we're talking about the Cuban Americans, of granting diplomatic relations to Cuba. There are those who are in favor, there are those that are not. I will only point out from a historic standpoint that the Castro regime in Cuba has not been friendly to the United States. They're the people that allowed Khrushchev to put Russian nuclear missiles, at least the missiles that would have been nuclear, in Cuba. And there was a thought, at least among one segment of the United States, that said, we are not going to deal with Cuba again until the Castros are dead. Fidel's old and not well. We haven't seen him publicly for many months, but he's still alive. Raul, his younger brother, is running the country. Cuba, as a socialist economy, failed a long time ago. The Soviet Union took over control, supporting Cuba for decades, because Cuba economically could not support itself. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that aid ended. Just in time, Hugo Chavez took over in Venezuela and began sending money to support Cuba from Venezuela. When the price of oil dropped so precipitously in the last year or so, Venezuela suddenly found itself in a desperate situation as well. They didn't have enough money left to support their own people. Their economy has been ravaged, as those economies always are, and that support to Cuba was going to be cut off. With the cutoff of that support, the support of the Castro brothers would have been very seriously in question. We have stepped in to save them just in time. I'll leave you with that. Our next story is New York City, the Golden Door, the day before we get to New York. See you then.